Thanksgiving was, of course, just a couple of days ago, and hopefully everybody had a blessed celebration with family and friends. No, it doesn't always work out necessarily the very easiest, but I do hope it was a good one this year. And we talked last Sunday, about how that can be difficult during troubled times. We don't always feel like celebrating. But it is still possible to be thankful when we remember all that the Lord has done and all that He promises to do. Still, even while remembering that, we know that suffering does happen in our lives. And the sting of it can actually be made worse when it is caused by the people closest to us, by those family and friends. When they let us down and even become our enemies, it increases the suffering. That's the situation that led David to write Psalm 55 that we're looking at today. And in our own similar, or at least maybe not the same, but adjacent circumstances, we need to know where to turn, because others will fail us. But the Lord is always good and trustworthy. We can cry out to Him for rescue from those who do evil, knowing that He will provide justice. So let's find this now in Psalm 55. There are Bibles scattered among the chairs around you, if anybody would want to grab one of those to be able to read along or refer back to as we go. It's good to have that available to you. But Psalm 55, we're going to start at verse 1. It says, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Attend to me and hear me. I am restless in my complaint and moan noisily because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in wrath they hate me. My heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. So I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander far off and remain in the wilderness. I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls. Iniquity and trouble are also in the midst of it. Destruction is in its midst. Oppression and deceit do not depart from its streets." And so there are a few themes that we should be able to recognize just from the other songs of lament that we have been going through. David, for one, he's afraid that the Lord would ignore his plight, that he's crying out and God might not hear him. But he goes to him anyway because he knows that there is nowhere else to turn. He needs the Lord to establish justice. So something that's maybe different in this one from some of the others, at least that we have seen of David's, is that he clearly feels that he is in an unfair situation this time. It's not always been the case for him. But there's no expression here about remorse or guilt on his part. He doesn't think he's done anything to deserve this. He's being hated by other people without a cause. And so that also plays into why he knows that his only hope is if God hears him and saves him, because there's nothing that he can do himself to make it right. He didn't do anything wrong in the first place. So he's powerless to escape otherwise if God doesn't help him. Again, that's why he prays. Now, we aren't told exactly what situation David was in, but very clearly it was a stressful one. He talks breathlessly about pain and death and all kinds of different phrases for being afraid. Terror and fearfulness and trembling and horror. He's like a hunted animal, and he wants to just be able to fly away like one. Now, he might not have had wings, of course, but flight was certainly a recurring feature of his personal history. We saw that over and over when it came to the time of King Saul, when he had to be on the run constantly. And then there was also, later on in his life, him having to flee from his son Absalom. And that raises a question for us. Is it good to want to escape? And the answer is that it depends. I actually see some people reacting like they knew that, so that's good. But it is. It's based on circumstances. J.R.R. Tolkien actually called it the distinction between the escape of the prisoner and the flight of the deserter. Because those are two very different ways of looking at running away, of escaping. In the former case, and he had especially in mind somebody who was wrongfully imprisoned, maybe like a prisoner of war, look at it that way. When you are in that circumstance, you want to be able to escape, and you think about the ways that you can try to get out in order to improve your circumstances. But the other side of it, the flight of the deserter, is just cowardice. And I think in this psalm, David is actually describing that when he talks about wanting to fly away. He's talking about that latter case. It is something that he is tempted to do, but knows it would be wrong, because here flying away would be giving up. And we shouldn't do that. We can't always run from our problems. There are things that we have to face, responsibilities that we have to meet, or else be condemned as cowards. But again, there is that other side to it. Maybe should not be running away, but rescue is ultimately what we need. It's what we have to be able to hope for, is that those prison walls would come down. It would be devastating to think that things could never change for the better. You'd lose all hope. And thankfully, God has promised that they will get better, that we will fly away from sin and death, or rather, again, that we will be flown away, because that was what Christ provided for. So we have to rely on Him to keep His word to transform sorrow into joy. And that's what David is here for. He's looking to the Lord for that relief and asking God to destroy the evil that is bringing him down, because it's hitting close to home. Now again, that's something that's going to become more focal in the next few verses, but it does at least begin to be hinted at here. Because the enemies are not described as being foreign adversaries. They are people looking to undermine Jerusalem from within. David's own citizens are causing trouble. And David asked the Lord to cause them trouble in return, to confuse them and to divide their counsels. And he actually says here to divide their tongues. What he's referring to is the Tower of Babel. He's praying for the Lord to do something pretty much like that, to make it impossible for them to work together to do evil. But we do, again, have to ask ourselves another question. Is that an appropriate attitude? Because David is praying for the destruction of his enemies. But Jesus later on would teach us to pray for the salvation of our enemies. So which is right? We should pretty easily be able to come to the conclusion that Jesus' way is always going to be the better one, and that is true. We are supposed to understand that we were the enemies of God apart from Him, but He saved us. And so we should want people to experience what we have. But that does not make David necessarily wrong. This is not a question of either or. This is a question of a primary and a secondary prayer. Because there can be no live and let live. It's what a lot of people want, is that we should just ignore all forms of evil and let them go. And they basically want God to do that too, but He won't. Evil, if it will not repent, will be punished. Because that is the only way for us to actually escape. That is the only way for the just to be freed from evil, is if evil is no longer present. And that is what God has said He will do. Now, He wants people to have a chance, but He won't ignore sin forever. And we can rightfully pray for its end if we first pray for people's rescue from it. That's why it's primary. It's our first and highest responsibility, but they actually go hand in hand. But of course, it's not easy to pray for people's rescue when they are in the middle of hurting us, and even more so when they were close to us. Again, that's what David is dealing with. That's what he says next, verse 12. For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide from him. But it was you, a man my equal, my companion and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together and walked to the house of God in the throng. Let death seize them. Let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. The deepest cause of David's complaint here was that his enemy was not far away. Rather, his enemy had been his friend. Someone close to him who had lived and worked and even worshiped with him, who had now betrayed him. And that loss of trust was as bad, maybe even worse, than the actual harm that was done. Because it wasn't like it was somebody he didn't know. Then he could have just, like he said, he could have ignored it. This is someone that he thought he knew well. And of course, it was also someone who knew him well, and therefore knew how to harm him most effectively. Which is something that I know we all experience, at least to an extent. I don't want to overstate the frequency of actual betrayal, because that is something specific, which unfortunately does happen. Friends can become enemies. Conflicts can arise between people who were at one time close to each other, but then whatever it is, it leads them to despise and even seek to destroy one another. That happens. Selfishness can lead to a breach of trust that cannot be repaired. And if there's any sort of frequency with that, where that happens the most, unfortunately, would be in marriages, when there's unfaithfulness. That's an actual betrayal. But it doesn't have to go to that extent for us to feel betrayed. And it's something that we have talked about on occasion, how there's a difference between the actual fact of something and how we feel about it. This is an example of that, because we are all, to some extent, selfish, or maybe that's even going a little bit too far. It's too harsh of a way of putting it. It's true enough. But what I'm talking about here is that we're just kind of self-centered maybe, or self-aware. I don't even know exactly what term would be best to use to describe it, but just that we filter everything through our own minds first. We just think about, how are things going to affect me? What choices do I need to be able to make in order to live and work and just carry on with my day-to-day life? That's all I'm referring to. I'm not even going as far necessarily as talking about sin. And so that leads us, and it leads people to do things for ourselves that might have consequences for other people. We do that to people, other people do that to us. No harm is necessarily meant. It may not even do all that much harm at all. We're talking about the sorts of things, why didn't he pick up milk on the way home? Why didn't she let me know that her mother was going to be over? Those sorts of little, kind of ultimately meaningless things, but even if it just inconveniences us, we can feel very frustrated by that, and we should consider that feeling of frustration very carefully. Because again, maybe there are some things where that other person has done something that they're at fault for. Maybe, though, we were just expecting too much. Our own, again, self-centeredness, for maybe lack of a better term, but that can lead us to think almost subconsciously that others exist just to serve us. We want them to behave for our benefit at all times, and so we are holding them to a standard against which they will, at some point, at many points, fall short. And that may not be their fault if our expectations were too high, because no other human being can satisfy all of our needs. If we rely on them to, we can only wind up disappointed. Our loved ones will sometimes hurt us. We have to work on being self-aware enough to know whether we set them up for failure, or if they really have done us wrong, like they must have to David. In either case, though, we have to turn to the only one who can actually provide for everything that we need. That's why David wrote this song. and what he does in closing at verse 16. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He has redeemed my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many against me. God will hear and afflict them, even he who abides from of old, because they do not change. Therefore they do not fear God. He's put forth his hand against those who were at peace with them. He's broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. But you, O God, shall bring them down to the pit of destruction. Bloodthirsty and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. This part of the psalm has a little bit of an odd movement because it doesn't focus on one thing. David goes back and forth, in a sense, between focusing on God and focusing on the enemy. And that does allow us to see the contrast between them. When we are surrounded and disappointed or betrayed, we have to go to God. And we should kind of see that the reason why there is a back and forth movement to this is because this is not something that we're just going to do once in a lifetime and then that's it. We can and should do it constantly. Because we can. God is always there for us. Every time we go through one of these circumstances where somebody, whether they know us or not, whether they were close to us or not, when they hurt us and we feel down, he's the one who can pick us up. And he's the only one who really can. The only one who can actually satisfy the longings of our souls. Because he alone has the power to protect us from everything that we are up against. And he will give us peace. And he's the enemy of those who break the peace. The people that we know, they say what sounds good, but only to be able to improve their own situation. And then they backstab as soon as the opportunity presents itself. They're two-faced. God is not. He's faithful. If he says something, he means it. And he has said that he will protect his people and destroy his enemies. And he doesn't have an ulterior motive. And he is not fickle. And he is not selfish. And he has proven that he can be trusted. And when you're hurting from what someone close to you has done, that's a good time to consider that Jesus went through your experience. Because he was betrayed by one friend. Can't forget, though, he was abandoned by all the rest. And he was condemned by authorities who had, even though there was, an animosity that existed between him and them, and he knew perfectly well what was in their hearts, they still had pretended to be friendly toward him, at least on a few occasions. So they had, those buttery words when there was something darker inside their hearts. And so as a result of all of that, he did not escape the suffering that resulted. He wasn't able to simply fly away from it. Actually had the power, but he didn't. Instead, he was rescued from it when he went through it all and then rose from the dead. And the reason he put up with that and put himself through that was so that he could be our rescue. That's how he has proved his trustworthiness. If no one else is, he is. And so that is why whoever else lets us down, we still need to trust in him. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, it's really a paraphrase of what we saw in Psalm 55, you have to cast all your care upon him, for he cares for you. He bore our sins, the weight of all that judgment that was against us, to leave it nailed to the cross, to defeat it forever. So he can certainly bear our frustrations and our sadnesses and our confusion, no matter what the people in our lives throw our way. And that disappointment is a universal experience. People will let you down. The better they know you, the more they can hurt you. But for anyone who does not know God, anybody here, anybody who's watching this, if you don't have a relationship with Him, you have to understand that disappointment is all that is in store for you if you stay that way. If you want real hope for rescue, you have to turn to Jesus Christ. And you should think about this. God made you because He loves you. He wants to be able to have a relationship with you and for you to be with Him. But in every way that you have defied His will for you, in every way that you have chosen yourself over Him, you have betrayed Him. You have done Him the harm that you hate other people doing to you. You've been hypocritical. And yet, even with that, Jesus still died for you to pay for those selfish acts so that you don't have to be punished for them. So accept the reconciliation that He's offering you, that He secured through His resurrection. Ask Him for His forgiveness and His life, and it will be yours. Can you finally let go of your pride and your selfishness and do that today? I hope that anybody who needs to respond to that message, that this will help you to do so. And that if there's anybody who would want to do that here with us, you're welcome to do so. We have time between when the end of this message, there's a song that plays for communion, and anybody who wants to do that here is welcome to do so. But it's also something you can do from wherever you are sitting, because it is God who needs to hear that you know that you need forgiveness, that Jesus died and rose again in order to make it available. It is as simple as that. Maybe not easy, but it is simple. It's straightforward, because it's not about how good you can make yourself. That's the whole point that so many people get caught up on, is that I have to be good enough for God, and you can't be. You have to believe how good He was for you. But now, to those who have already made Christ your Savior and Lord, the encouragement of this psalm is that you need to keep turning to Him, praying for relief and the proper rescue. Not to be able to give up, but to be able to see good triumph and for evil to be destroyed, because that is God's promise. Just, again, don't make retribution your only desire. The people, even those who have hurt you, need prayer for their good too, just like those you've experienced. Now, you may have to be away from them. I'm not saying that you have to necessarily put up with the people that hurt you and keep them in your life and be a doormat to them. It's just don't give up on them when you approach the Lord. Ask Him to guide them to salvation before they face destruction. And as you have opportunity with them and anyone else that you do come across, share your hope that disappointments and betrayals can be overcome, those they have experienced and those that they have caused, if they know to trust the Lord.